So I'd like now to introduce our next speaker. Andrew Mayock is the Federal Chief Sustainability Officer for the Executive Office of the President. Andrew is going to join me to talk about how the Biden-Harris administration is making climate change a top priority and how the federal government is reducing its own climate impacts. Andrew, thanks. Great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us. So, federal government is the world's largest purchaser of goods and services, I guess, totaling over $650 billion annually. And I know the federal government has long used that to shape markets and stimulate markets. How are you thinking about that in your role, and how is the Biden administration leveraging that role to accelerate the net zero transition?
Yeah, an important question, goes to the core of what we do. Want to say a few things about up front about this conference today and this week. One is thanks to you and thanks to your partners in hosting this conference. Thanks to the audience that's here. I think one of the really important things about the work that we're all engaged in, as I looked at the audience list, is you've got leadership here that's been at this for a very long time, at this at a time when it wasn't an extremely popular thing to do. Laying that foundational work as others have come in to join us. Just a huge thanks and a huge point of gratitude to folks in this room that are on the front lines and have been on the front lines. Also wanted to note a thanks to Nat here, who I had the opportunity to serve in the Obama administration, and I had the opportunity to work on a transition project to seek how we best accelerate climate in a new administration, in a Biden administration. And there were about 20 of us, mostly former Obama climate people, who set out on this project, and there couldn't have been a more thoughtful, rigorous, insightful, can-do person in the room in driving this plan than Nat Cohen. And having him in this organization to continue that work is a great service to the cause. So thank you for that. I also wanted to thank other federal partners that are here today and this week. I know DOE and DOD and EPA and GSA are all represented, and people like Kevin Kampshire will be here. And we couldn't be at a time in leveraging the federal footprint at a time of greater cohesiveness and partnership in delivering than we are with our federal friends, including Janet, who you just heard for, and she's a special friend of ours from the White House, and that Janet's agency actually funds the Office of the Chief Sustainability Officer at the White House, and we couldn't have a stronger supporter than Janet and EPA. On the leveraging front and the strategy and where we are now, another reason I'm excited to be here today, and our colleagues are joining us today, is we have a big opportunity here as we all set our own very ambitious agendas to learn together and grow together. And from a leverage perspective, I hope many of you had the opportunity to see President Biden's federal sustainability plan. The key pillars of it include basically reforming and transforming how we buy, manage, and operate pretty much everything we do in the federal government. So moving our fleet, the world's largest fleet of over 600,000 vehicles, to 100% electric, zero emission, from a 1% base where we are right now, to move our electricity consumption as the country's largest electricity consumer of over 54 terawatt hours a year and a spend of $4.5 billion a year on that electricity, to 100% carbon free no later than 2030, and for 50% of that to be 24/7, to move our buildings portfolio of over 300,000 buildings to net zero no later than 2040, to do all that in this time of massive change and disruption, and caring for, from an adaptation and resilience perspective, making sure that we're caring for the immediate impacts that we're feeling today. And also to do this and execute this plan by making sure that we're bringing every federal employee into the plan, into the game, and that we're incorporating environmental justice in our operations and what we do, and that we're utilizing our platform to bring more action into climate action overall. So I think those are the sort of the big pillars of the plan. Those are the ways that we're seeking to leverage it. I'll say more about that as we go ahead, but that's probably a good overview about the leverage.
Well, thanks. I want to ask one additional piece on that, which I know you spoke so much about and the really impressive numbers and stats on the federal government's own purchasers, but as you're also asking suppliers, right, to disclose their own emissions, and I know this is something a lot of the companies in the room are thinking about with the potential SEC proposal on disclosure. So can you say a little bit more about that as well, what you're asking of your suppliers?
Absolutely. When we look at it, when we think about our own decarbonization plan, like you, I'm sure, when we look at scope 1 and scope 2, and then scope 3, we see scope 3, not surprisingly, is 2x our scope 1 and 2. And so we have a responsibility as we look at it to lower that. We have a responsibility with our suppliers to up our game as a whole. So there's a few ways that we're doing that. One is through major supplier GHG disclosure and putting rules in the federal rule book for our suppliers and how they serve us to make sure that they're then required to report on GHG, they're required to report on climate risk, and required to set science-based targets. We're at a place right now where that rule is about to become a proposed rule and a public rule from a process perspective, so lots more details on that to come in the very near future. But it will have those components in it as is shared with the public, and it goes through the comment period and becomes final. And basically, like many folks in the room here today, is what gets measured gets done, gets managed. And as you all and many of you have executed your own transparency, we want to make sure that we, with our colleagues in the SEC and other parts of the government, make sure that we set a certain standard and we help drive that standard.
Thanks. I want to go to another topic which you mentioned as well, and which Janet really focused in on, which I think is on all our minds, which is the issue of equity and justice and how to integrate that in. You mentioned that as a core pillar of the sustainability plan, so maybe say a little bit more about that as well.
Yeah, I think as observers and partners see, there is a significant push by the president to address environmental justice, to address equity. And so when we drafted the federal sustainability plan and we came up with the concepts and the core pieces of it, a big part of it inevitably became how we go execute those issues when it comes to federal operations. And it's showing up in a couple ways. One, on the equity front, our colleagues at OMB and other parts of the White House are really driving a new equity agenda that is dramatically changing the way that we're engaging our suppliers from an equity perspective. And then CEQ on the environmental justice side on operations, we're now in a strategy process of figuring out how we embed it in all the work that I just mentioned, whether it's purchasing carbon-free electricity as we roll out that plan, whether it's purchasing the vehicles. What is our relationship to disadvantaged communities in the many places that we are throughout the United States? And then how do we become better and best actors as community members to those communities? So we're working through the strategy now. One thing that we're doing is taking a look at benchmarking and other approaches that corporates or public sector operations have used as we go draft our own strategy. And we're also working in close concert with our friends in the White House at the Council on Environmental Quality, who are driving the broader programmatic EJ40 environmental justice approach.
Excellent. Well, thanks. So I want to come back to the plan, the sustainability plan. Folks in the audience may not know this. I know you're a former management consultant, so you think a lot about management. So you've got some really big goals there. You mentioned getting the fleet to zero-emitting vehicles. You talked about the carbon-free 24/7 clean electricity and so on. How do you think about managing this program across the whole federal government to make sure that it's successfully implemented when you've got all these really ambitious goals?
No small task. I think everyone in the room, it would resonate with you that it's one thing to set a target, it's another thing to deliver. And it's certainly a challenge on the statistics that I rolled out with a federal government as large as ours, with the asset base, the 300,000 plus buildings, 600,000 plus vehicles, and in a federated system to go deliver on that. So what's happening this year, having announced the plan in December, and even before we announced the plan, what was happening last year, is that we were working on a two-part strategy. One is, how do we put points on the board right now that are available and we can achieve, and that will send a clear message that we're serious and we're delivering. So there's a piece of the strategy to go deliver with zero-emission vehicles, whether it's which we'll have a lot more to say on as this year transpires and we continue to work through the supply chain issues with our suppliers on how many we're able to then deliver in the federal system this year. Significantly more than last year and more than any time in the federal government's history ever. On carbon-free electricity, we have our friends at the Department of Defense and GSA moving out with an RFI that will move to an RFP about how we go purchase electricity in retail markets according to the plan. So you see a bunch of action that's happening with under the general mantras of points on the board now, but more importantly, how we build data-driven, systems-based approach across the board so that all the agencies and the agencies from an enterprise perspective have the foundation that they need to go deliver. So that on the longer-term plan, there's all the classic components of any transformation that any management consultant would go counsel their clients on, whether it's changing systems, whether it's gathering data, whether it's moving through change management, whether it's identifying what's the current human capital configuration and the skill base for this. We're going through all those steps in a very methodical way to make sure that we have the foundation in place for the long term to go deliver on these aggressive interim targets.
And let me ask a quick follow-up there, which is, how do you think in that long term? I mean, how do you think about changing, or are you there yet to think about changing the underlying systems, changing the underlying approach so that even beyond this administration, those goals, and many of those goals are 2030, 2035, Biden administration will be out by then. So how do you think about changing that long-term system so that the trajectory remains the same?
Yeah, I think that happens, and I'm sure the audience members are experiencing this yourselves, is that it is one thing to work with current systems to go make the purchases off the GSA supply list. It's another thing to build in, as I mentioned, from like a change management perspective, all the fleet managers in all the fleets of that 600,000 vehicle portfolio. And so what we're working on from the center, and it's us in the White House along with our colleagues in the White House, the Climate Policy Office, the Office of Management and Budget, pretty much all policy offices, including NSC, OSTP, working very closely with General Services Administration, Department of Energy, EPA in particular, as sort of a core central organizing group that's helping put the guides in place, the human capital plan in place, making sure that we have the budget to support the resources that are necessary to do this. So there's a lot of blocking and tackling on those fronts right now. And again, to the folks in the audience, one of the things, a narrative that we're experiencing is that in 2015, 2016 era of federal sustainability plans, the federal government was really out there as a leader and starting to do this work. And then we sat it out at best, if not went backwards over the next 4 years. Meanwhile, I think in that stage, 2015, 2016, a lot of corporates and a lot of public sector making commitments, but not serious work and serious points on the board again. But oh my, how that has changed. Lots of real work and real effort and real delivery has gone on. And so for the good news of that narrative is that we can, to Janet's point, I am all about stealing good ideas that can be imported into the federal government, customized to the federal government, and then delivered. And there's more than we can digest at this point. There's been so much action in the system. So there's a lot of strategic choices that are happening here in the early years, but the goal being, to your point about how do you embed it, how do you make it last, you build it into all the various components, whether it's budget or the federal rules that I mentioned regarding GHG disclosure, or very wonky things that are sacred text inside the government for those who might have served things that have titles like A11, A194, that are OMB circulars that really embed the activity that we're doing. Full court press.
Yeah, that's, well, one thing that I was just thinking about when you were giving that, you were sort of rattling off all the partners, the federal government partners you're working with. One of the things you mentioned, the transition planning we were both helping out with from the outside, and that was like the mantra was whole of government approach, and that's, I think, a great example of the whole of government approach.
I'd make a comment on that too, which is, if I may, Nat, in that when we sat in conference rooms and Zoom calls and cooking up what we thought would be an aggressive push to make climate action really accelerate. I can interview you here. I'd love to hear your view on this. I thought the stuff that we cooked up was pretty good and a pretty aggressive push, and I aspired to be a part of that. What's become reality outstripped my wildest dreams about this, in that we've got every agency head leaning in on this in significant ways, and has made it part of their daily short list of priorities. That trickles down through and moves down through the whole of the bureaucracy. We have a time where we put out a call to do some work on adaptation and resilience, and we get oversubscribed by the number of feds that want to come and be a part of these projects. So it's a time of enormous energy and desire to deliver on this, versus when we were last serving together. It was a time where you were pestering people about this stuff to try to make them pay attention and put some money in their budget. That has changed, and it's changed dramatically.
Yeah, I think the way you see climate, I mean, obviously the Sustainability Office is one example of that, but seeing climate really incorporated into pretty much every department and agency at the leadership level, I think is really remarkable. So we've just got about a minute left, so I want to ask a lot of folks in this room who are big fans and supporters of the federal sustainability plan, what's your message to folks in this room?
I'd say two things. One is, as I was mentioning throughout this chat, we're here to learn, we're here to steal, and we'd love best practices. We're doing a lot of it already. So when it comes to carbon-free electricity, we're talking to all the major players that have gone out there and achieved their goals, and we're doing the benchmarking and the study about how they got there to go apply it in the federal system. So please let us know, and please reach out to us. You can reach out to us on sustainability.gov. There's an email address there. It gets to us. It gets to me, and we want to accelerate our work through your work. So let us know. And number two is, a key part of this is doing what we're doing here today, is bringing more folks to the table, and making this a much bigger group of people delivering on this shared set of goals and interests. So we'll be seeking for you to join us and for us to join you to drive more climate action and more parties to the table.
Well, I'm sure you'll get a lot of people to take you up on that offer.
I look forward
Andrew,
to it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.